Hello my dear friends, how are you? My name is Arithurger and today I'm going to talk about the cult of the ancestors. Now, this is by far the longest video I've ever done. Just pretend you are in a classroom attending a lecture or a documentary. And well, because this is such an extensive video, I have divided this into 4 parts. The first part is what exactly are the ancestors, why honoring them. The second part is about the cult of the ancestors. I will give a couple of examples from other cultures and then I will focus on the Germanic and Norse traditions, making comparisons. The third part is about the concept of honoring the ancestors, and the fourth part and final is about how you can apply all of this information into modern heathenry and the general approaches of heathenry towards the ancestors, and a couple of easy activities you can do to honor your ancestors in modern times. Also, just one other quick point, this video was requested by one of my patrons, Mr. Colin Patterson. Thank you so much, my dear friend. Now, don't worry, I won't waste time in explaining how you can become my patron and how you can request a video about a specific subject. I will leave down below in the description all you need to know about that. So, with no more delay, let's get started, my dear friends. Let's start by trying to understand what exactly are the ancestors in the Norse pagan view. In the Norse paganism, there are many ways to come in contact and honor the dead. Although the information about this specific cult can either be vague or there are so many concepts, ideas and suppositions that it gets confusing. Honoring and worshipping the ancestors was an important part in the religious life of the pre-Christian cultures. It wasn't something limited to Norse, Germanic and Celtic cultures. It was a very important practice in every pagan background. The dead remained in the community's collective memory long after they were gone, and their resting places served as landmarks to reinforce the continuation of their memory for ages to come. It was believed that in such places the dead resided and were able to apply blessings and advice upon the land and the people they left behind. The blessings upon the land were often in the form of fertility, which was greatly needed in every farming field. If we think about it, it's actually pretty obvious why this connection to fertility, the decaying of the body nourishing the earth. Now, take the case of the god Freyr himself. It is said that he was once a king of the Swedes, and upon his death they buried him at Uppsala to ensure the continuation of the fertility of the land. For as long as he was there, there would always be peace and prosperity. Or take the case of King Ulfdane, whose reign was one of peace and plenty, a very prosperous time. Upon his death, many were those who wanted to bury him in the districts belonging to his domains, to ensure good fortune. So they divided his body, literally, and buried him in different districts, and so everyone was happy to have his blessings all over the place. The cult of the ancestors wasn't just a cult dedicated to mythical ancestors, such as gods, land spirits, heroes, or unknown family members. The cult was extended to all of the dead, especially the ones we met and saw them depart. In the Norse case, generally, the dead family members were buried in the farm, sometimes in a single grave for one specific individual, or a collective grave, or a burial mound. The ancestors were kept nearby because the main belief was that they did not actually die, they did not cease to live, and their spiritual forms remained. Death was seen as a passage to a new stage of existence, so people simply didn't cease to exist. They would live underground, literally, and their tombs, burial mounds, were the physical points used to contact with them. It was the boundary between two realities, the world of the living and the spiritual world. This is why in the Celtic culture, burial mounds were seen as literally being gateways to the underworld. In prehistoric times, all the way to the Bronze Age and certain cultural pockets of the Iron Age, the underworld was literally the earth beneath our feet. The dead didn't go to some unreachable place. They were right here with us, which facilitated contacting with them. And why would we want to contact with the dead? Because the dead were a source of wisdom. The type of dead-related pagan practices of our ancestors had a heavy percentage of what we could call nowadays as necromancy, meaning there was a lot of religious activities centered on the dead, working with the dead, spending time with the dead, and actually have physical proximity with the dead to the point of actually being in contact with them. This doesn't mean our ancestors were only focused on the dead and every religious activity was dedicated to the dead. No. There were loads of religious activities in all sorts of fields and for different purposes. There was a balance. But without a doubt, our ancestors were much more in contact with the dead than we do nowadays, which leads us to wrongly believe that they were only concerned with the dead. The dead were not only a source of wisdom, but also a source of fertility and abundance. Developing healthy relationships with them, honoring them, keeping them happy and sharing with them our experiences and keeping them present in our daily affairs help to strengthen the bonds between the living and the dead family members, both in a material way and spiritually. The cult of the ancestors did not belong to the cult of the gods. Certainly, in the Norse religious mind, the gods were the ancestors of mankind, but when it comes to honoring, worshipping, venerating, the gods are the gods and the ancestors are the ancestors. In the life of the ancient pagans, honoring the dead wasn't of less importance than honoring the gods. If anything, archaeologically speaking, the further north you go, in the European continent at least, the better you can perceive that in a lot of cases the cult of the ancestors was much more active and more frequent than the cult of any deity. Because the ancestors were the ones with a greater link to the living. They had been literally the people who created us, gave birth to us, and a very strong and direct link was maintained. And this is reflected on the idea of fate and destiny, Urlog and Weird. The past cannot be changed, we cannot change who gave birth to us, we cannot change the ancestral line of our people, and the past inevitably will affect our lives. We will always carry with us our ancestors, no matter how good or bad they were. They are part of our bloodline, and that is an unbreakable connection. This is why the ancestors were much more praised than the gods, because family members were more likely to help you because they lived in and with you. The ancestors in the everyday life of the ancient pagans were even more important than the gods themselves. It all goes down to this simple thought. Who are the people who care more about you? Your parents, grandparents, your children, or the king, queen, president of your country? This same thought was applied to the relationship our pagan ancestors had with the spiritual world. There are those in it who care more about you than the other ones. We are all aware that we have come here into this world because of our ancestors, and we would not even exist without them. But the worship of the ancestors was not just for our own gain, our own private wishes, and solely for our own benefits. The cult of the ancestors was about exchanging something with them. Practically the same thing as with the gods. We give something and they give something else back to us. Exchange of gifts to strengthen the bonds of friendship, and it's beneficial for both sides. This is when we have to enter in the complex understanding of the spiritual self, which I will make a video solely about it, the parts of the self. But for now, suffice to say that we give to our ancestors what is called the main, and they give it back. It is the strength, the force, power, vitality, our own essence given to the ancestors, and they give their main to us. Because it's with that force, that ancestral essence, that we gain enthusiasm and strength to do what we must do to survive in this world. It is a circle created between us and the spirits, and this circle maintains the stability of your family, kindred, clan or tribe. So it's not about asking for money, for a love relationship, or for a house, a car, whatever. It's about asking for the force that will allow you to be physically and spiritually ready to do all it takes to get what you desire. You are asking for enthusiasm, for something that will influence your luck, for something that will empower you to become what you need to be in order to achieve all your goals, all your purposes in life. So, this is what the ancestors are, spiritual entities from whom we can receive something in return for what we can give to them. They are not just memories, distant shadows of the past in some corner of our minds, which falls into forgetfulness with the passing of the ages. The cult of the ancestors is much more than just thinking about them. They are individuals on a different stage of existence, on another reality. We are as much ghosts to them as they are to us. We are just on different spaces, but what we have in common is both existence and a link to bloodline. The cult of the ancestors is to give both a physical and spiritual space to our ancestors, a space in our house and a space in our thought dedicated to them. It's keeping them close. Each one of us has one or more ancestors who accompany us throughout life and protect us, which is often called etherphilia. Some ancestors who follow us through life and are directly attached to our spiritual self. To the Norse pagans, there was a clear relationship between the self and the various spiritual beings that are part of the self's essence. The paganism of our ancestors had no sense of individual spirit or no sense of duality of the self, a body and a soul. There were many parts of the self, and being aware of these parts and maintaining a close relationship with them just strengthens our relationship with the spiritual world. In the cult of the ancestors, people would leave offerings of food and drink that appealed to the dead. People would invoke them, tell them stories. The relationship with the dead was much like the relationships between the living. This entire cult around the ancestors was to show respect and devotion to those who came before us. Understanding that there is no barrier between life and death is an essential part of the pagan spiritual understanding. Now, let's move on to the second part of this video, the cult of the ancestors. Many ancient cultures worshipped, honored, maintained contact of some sort with the ancestors. But as I've said, it wasn't about venerating all the dead, only those who have reasons to worry about us and are interested in helping. In a variety of cultures we have the custom to venerate our ancestors, not necessarily as gods, although in some cultures the dead were venerated absolutely as divinities or as beings very close to the category of the divine, that somehow achieved divinity through their deeds while in life or in death. The cult of the ancestors is something highly adopted by almost every culture because, if we think about it, of all the mythological and folklore beings, our dead ancestors are the ones we can say with 100% certainty that they actually existed. So even for the most skeptic, the cult of the ancestors is more likely for them to accept than the cult of any deity or other spiritual entities. But of course you must believe in the existence of another reality beyond this one, or at the very least, life after death. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Among the ancient Greeks and Romans, even before the creation of the Greco-Roman gods we know of, before the classical deities gained anthropomorphic shapes, there was the family cult, the domestic worship, the worshipping of the ancestors, centered in the house, the sacred fire held within the property, keeping the fire alive and active as a source of light, but also as a source of energy provided by the dead ancestors. A great feast was offered, the meal cooked in the sacred fire and left near the tomb of the ancestor, a sacred feast only done by the relatives of the deceased, those who belonged to his domestic cult. In Rome, this cult gave rise to the cult of the Lares, often confused with the Penates, ancestral gods associated with the sacred fire and the home, and with the Manes, ancestral spirits. The Lares were guardian deities of the hearth fire, the home and domestic affairs, also associated with plenty and harmony within the domestic boundaries. The Lares, much like the Germanic Matronae, could be guardians of both the domestic area and of a neighborhood, and even of the city, crossroads and paths. It was common to mix the ancestral cult with the cult of diverse protective spirits. It was also common to see the Lares depicted in family altars, the Lararium. Take a close look at this example. Two Lares on each side of an ancestral genie, spirit, above a serpent, which is a symbol of fertility and prosperity. The ancestral genie carries a bowl of offerings and is clothed with ceremonial vestment used in sacrifice. In Portuguese, one word for home is lar, still retaining this ancient Roman cult of the ancestors. The sacred fire was later associated with the goddess Vesta, the goddess of the domestic fire, the hearth, always virgin and pure, just like the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of Vesta, who protected the sacred fire of Rome, never to let it extinguish and constantly feeding the flames to keep Rome protected and safe. The sacred fire had no impurities. Nothing considered unclean was given to it, nor impure acts were made before it. This cult of the sacred fire is also present in the Vedic religion known as Agni, meaning fire. This cult and all this ideology was so strong among Greeks, Romans and even Hindus that the land where the ancestors were buried, which was often the property of the family, the house where the ancestral fire resided, could not be sold or passed on to third parties. This property did not belong to a single individual or the family currently residing there, but to the lineage, the bloodline of the ancestors buried in that property, and therefore it was not permitted to get rid of this property, this space where the house of the ancestors was. However, the lineage could be extinguished. The cult of the ancestors in ancient Rome and Greece was a patriarchal cult based on tracing descendants through the male line. When the women of the family were married, they abandoned their family and started to belong to the family of their husband, which means they started to belong to their husband's family cults. But you could always adopt a male child to ensure that this cult and the property continued within the family. For as long as there were male descendants, the family cult could continue and the property belonged to them. This adoption of a male child, which was a highly religious act, is a very important aspect in the cult of the ancestors. At a certain point, it did not matter the bloodline in the cult of the ancestors. What actually mattered was the bonds established with the ancestors. A person could adopt the ancestors of another family, and the ancestors themselves would adopt that person as their own family member. This entire concept of a property belonging to a family because their ancestors are buried there already comes from the early Neolithic, especially noticeable in Western Europe. The great burial mounds and dolmens were a landmark and were the physical proof that that land belonged to someone because that someone's ancestors were buried there for many generations. And this continues to be practiced till the Bronze Age, where we can clearly see there is a founding structure of the very first ancestor, and then all her descendants are buried around it in their own burial mounds or chambers, or the remains deposited around the founding ancestor. Now, what about the Germanic and Norse peoples? I did not pick the Greek, Roman and Hindu examples at random. I'm sure you have found a lot of similarities in there. Among the Germanic peoples, it wasn't that different. It is believed that the worshipping of the ancestors took place in the home, within the property, most likely led by the patriarch of the family, who in turn passed on the family rights to his male children, especially the eldest son. It was most likely centered on the household fire, the one made in the center of the house, which was used both to cook food and to warm the environment. Basically, it was the heart of the home. However, it's also important to take note that to the Norse, there were two main celebrations to honor the ancestors: Dísarblot and Alfablot. Little is known about these celebrations because they were domestic celebrations, especially the Alfablot, which consisted in a cult in honor of the dead ancestors and the spirits of the land. No one outside the family could enter the property while these rites were being held, so it was kept in secrecy. The Dísarblot, on the other hand, was also a public celebration, but also a domestic, private one. It was to honor the female spirits of both the ancestors, goddesses, land spirits, etc. And this domestic cult was probably led by the matriarch of the house. We must not forget that in the Norse societies, many women became the owners of their husbands' properties and could choose to be unmarried for the rest of their lives. So these domestic cults would continue within the property, and it was the owner's job to continue the tradition, regardless of gender. Honoring the ancestors was to ensure the continuation of the presence of the ancestors within the property and in the family, to ensure the fertility of the land and to give a continuation to the luck belonging to that family. Luck, hemingia, traveled in the bloodline. It's a concept I shall speak about later, but suffice to say, it wasn't an abstract concept. It was actually part of the self, a spiritual force residing in each individual, which was passed on by their ancestors, which is why many children were given the name of their ancestors. It was a form of calling upon that ancestor to help the child and keep the hemingia flowing in the family. The family's good fortune, the fertility and prosperity of the family were strongly linked to the ancestors as much as they are linked to the living. The belief in the power held by the ancestors buried in a property was so strong that over the ages it gave rise to new and different types of spirits. Some folklore beings, such as the Swedish tomte and the Norwegian nis, are believed to have their origins in the ancestral cult, and that they are what's left of the essence of these ancestors buried in the earth. Such creatures started to be seen as protectors of the land. Elves were often thought to protect the burial chambers and the hills where ancestors rested. So cults around such beings were also introduced in the cult of the ancestors, such as honoring the Dísir, the land spirits, because such spirits had a direct connection with the ancestors. They resided in the same places where the ancestors rested. So also honoring such beings was being in contact with the ancestors, or rather, it was to facilitate the contact with the ancestors. Land spirits and elves occupied in many aspects the same role as the ancestors in the religious costumes of the pre-Christian Northern Europeans. Even the dwelling places of these beings started to be associated with those of the dead. Elves were traditionally associated with the burial mounds and chambers of the dead ancestors, so sacrifices to these beings were commonly placed in the same space as that of the dead. In the saga of King Olaf the Holy of Norway, he and his servant ride near the burial mound of the king's ancestor, Olaf Greitstadolfar, Olaf the Elf of Greystad, a title given to the king's ancestor which implies that his ancestor eventually became an Olfar, an elf. So many of the elven kind were actually ancestors who became those types of spirits. To the Norse there seems to be a clear difference between the elves being a specific race and ancestors upon death being able to become elves in the sense of spiritual entities watching over the land and offering blessings in exchange for gifts. I have already mentioned the Matronae in the ancient continental Germanic lands. In Phrygia and Gaul we find hundreds of votive stones dedicated to the Matronae, the ancestral mothers usually represented in groups of 3. These entities were somehow the ancestral mothers, ancestral female spirits and goddesses. To them it was given offerings of fruits, fish and meat, and they were linked to the earth, life, birth and fertility in general. The Matronae and their cult was extended to regions. They weren't only part of the domestic cult, so naturally there were hundreds of these local goddesses, and some of which took the names of local rivers, lakes and other landmarks in the area, or such landmarks gained those names because of the local deities residing in each specific area. These votive stones to the ancestral mother goddesses have names that go back to Germanic or Celtic peoples, but the inscriptions are in Latin. The invading Romans who settled in these lands ended up adopting the local deities, so the worship of the ancestral mothers predates the arrival of the Romans. In the Scandinavian panorama, as I have mentioned before, there was the cult of the Dísir, the Scandinavian equivalents of the continental Matronae. But unlike the Matronae, the Dísir did not usually have names, and their relation to the rivers and springs disappears, although not their ancestral aspect. The Dísir, as well as the Matronae, were the protective guardians of the home and family since times immemorial, and were considered to some extent as being associated with the family's hurdre, in relation to the Norns and fate. Their presence can be both positive, leading to good fortune, and negative. There are sagas about vengeful Dísir, which in some cases cause the deaths of some family members they are bound to. Just like the Germanic Matronae, there is an aspect of fertility associated with the Dísir, but they are also associated with war. In some places, the Dísir became indistinguishable from the Valkyries, which were actually called the Dísir of Odin. There are also points in folklore where Land Dísir are mentioned, female versions of the Land Dísir. The word Dís, singular form of Dísir, by itself can mean both goddess and woman. Freya herself receives the title of Vanadís, the woman of or the goddess of the Vanir. And remember when I've spoken earlier about the Etherphilia, the type of philia which can be an ancestor and follows us throughout our lives, well, this type of philia is usually friendly, benign, and it's a woman. Obviously, what is implicit is the tenderness and caring factors often attributed to mothers or women in general. Now, let's move on to the third part. A significant part of ancient pagan practices involved honoring the ancestors. While alive, our ancestors were people with aspirations, hopes, and dreams. They had families and friends they loved, had success and difficulties, and if it were not for their hard work, dedication, and sacrifices, we would not be here. Part of our spiritual self, the herlog, is passed on to us by our ancestors, and what we do in life will affect, at some extent, the fate of our own children, and that herlog will pass on to their own children, and on it goes. We share blood, culture, heritage with our ancestors, and it is through our ancestors that we find our connections with the gods. Ancient pagans had different ideas about where our ancestors would go upon death. Some would go into the hole of our ancestors in hell, or perhaps they would just remain resting in their tombs. In the end, it didn't really matter where they are, because what matters is the belief that our ancestors are aware of us and care for us throughout our lives. Our ancestors are still capable of giving advice and a little luck to a deserving descendant. Our ancestors are interested in us and can look after us during a difficult time. Nevertheless, we owe our ancestors our lives, and they deserve to be honored and remembered. Many neo-pagans focus a lot on the gods, and only after a long time they develop a genuine interest in honoring their ancestors. This is probably due to the traditional religions within which many neo-pagans were raised. In our Western culture, religion revolves around honoring a god or gods. For the great majority, Christianity is the religion they came from, which is a religion whose entire focus lies in worshipping its god. So it makes sense why new pagans first focus on the gods and do not usually come to understand the importance of honoring their ancestors until they have spent some time within any pagan branch. They are usually seeking patterns and similarities between their previous god and the old gods which are new to them. But within the pagan mind, our ancestors have a direct interest in us and in how we live our lives. They share kinship with us, so honoring them and making them proud is of great importance. So I do think it's a sort of duty for older pagans to teach the new pagans how to honor and give a proper value to their ancestors, because that will send them in an interesting path which might be less confusing, and from that point on they can develop the rest. This raises the question: how do we pagans honor our Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever ancestors? Frankly, I do not think that there is any difference in how we honor our pagan ancestors from our Christian ancestors. As I've said before, at a certain point it did not matter bloodlines. What mattered was the bond we created with them. We honor them by getting to know them, remembering them, giving them gifts, being worthy of living, passing on to our children and our children's children good values and ideals, so in that way they might make us proud someday. All ancestors, regardless of the religion they professed in life, would certainly appreciate everything we do for them. It's not religion that truly makes us who we are. Certainly it helps in building our personality, but it's our individuality that truly counts. There are plenty of ways to honor our ancestors, one of which, get to know your ancestors. One of the best ways to start is to talk to your living relatives and find out all there is to know about your grandparents, great-grandparents, or your distant relatives, as well as any of your living relatives that your lineage can trace. Take notes, write down their names and their stories. That's exactly how I found out I have Swedish ancestry and fortunately was able to maintain certain traditions and cults to specific deities. Gather as much information as you can, because honestly, we have already lost loads of knowledge with the passing of the ages and with the introduction of oppressive religions. So now it should be your commitment, at the very least, to retrieve as much information as you can from your past, from your family members and their history, their origins, and in this way you are honoring your ancestors because you are keeping their stories alive. In this way, the path before you throughout your life will be much more clear. Certainly, there is always the case that you might be adopted or you don't know who your parents are, and there are no living relatives to share with you their knowledge of the past. But remember, every one of us has ancestors, even if you don't know them. Dedicate some time in honoring them. They are worthy of being honored and to receive gifts, and there are always those you created strong bonds with, and they are now gone. Why not honoring them if they meant something important to you? The act alone of knowing the ancestors and all the time and sacrifice that can be spent in this process is a great gift to your ancestors. And the knowledge you gain from it makes your connection to them, with them, and your ability to honor them much stronger. Now, let's move on to the fourth and last part finally. Let's take a look at some modern approaches that exist within modern heathenry when it comes to honor our ancestors. In modern heathenry, some pagans honor an idealized image of the unknown ancestors or cultural hero. This approach tends to be pan-Germanic, with modern pagans taking an interest in a wide variety of Nordic European heroes and idealistic images, regardless of whether the individual heathen has a personal connection to the nationality or culture in which the heroic figure originated. Some focus on very specific heroes we know by names and by stories and legends, or focus on more than one general ideal archetype. For instance, there is a great respect and attention given to the figure of the Germanic warrior fighting against the invading Romans, or the figure of the Viking fighting against the Christians. But there is also the archetype of the strong, independent woman, taking care of the farm, children, the entire domestic industry, and a huge role in the religious and magical activities. The Norse explorer and his bravery going into open seas, distant lands, into the unknown. The point is, this sort of approach, with its connections to cultural ideals and heroes, leads many modern heathens to speak of our ancestors rather than my ancestors when talking about the cult or worshipping of the ancestors. There is a general mutual respect for our ancestors, even if people within heathenry have no connection whatsoever with each other. This is simply referring to all those who came before us, with a specific focus on all those who have honored the same gods we are trying to honor and were faithful to the way of our people before the religious conversions Europe suffered. This sort of approach has its benefits because the fact is, most of us have ancestors from various areas of Northern Europe and continental Europe of cultures who share similarities in their old ways. And about these ancestors, there is no way of knowing their names or specific stories. There is not enough information to allow us to identify specific ancestors or even their origins. The interest we have in various cultures, heroes and archetypal characters of Northern Europe gives us a connection with the past where there is no specific known connection. And this makes us feel better, and so we address them all as our ancestors. Then there is also the cultural identity factor. Everything belonging to a specific culture we enjoy and we follow and honor, which belong to real ancestors. You are honoring the specific culture and traditions of your ancestors. For instance, the individual, knowing that he or she is descendant primarily from Swedish descent, totally or partially, will focus into learning about Swedish history, Swedish traditions in general. Another individual, mainly descendant of Danish ancestors, focuses on all cultural aspects of the culture and traditional history of Denmark. So instead of a general approach, as I have previously described, this sort of approach focuses much more on specific cultural traditions, which brings a person closer to their ancestors, which allows us to preserve tradition so we may keep it alive and later pass on to our children. And honoring our ancestors lives on. So certainly this sort of approach to heathenry may have a much deeper meaning for heathens to pursue, because there is a more specific connection between her own cultural background and ancestral history. And then there is the case of those who have no perceptible ancestry to Northern Europe, but still they are heathens and practice the old ways. Oh, I know what many modern heathens think about this. And I, personally, do not believe in cultural appropriation. I believe in cultural appreciation. And if someone appreciates a culture enough to even honor the gods of that culture, we should let them. The more people appreciating a specific culture, the better chances we have of that culture surviving and enduring throughout the ages. Certainly, there are some side effects to this. It often happens that one culture overlaps another culture, and then tradition is lost. It's what happened with everyone who was forcibly converted to Christianity. Much of their own cultures were lost. But that was a very good historical example of not making the same mistake again. I think we are all smart enough to not let that happen again. So it doesn't matter who appreciates a specific culture, in this case, the Northern European cultures. What matters is that by practicing those traditions, the cultures remain alive and active, and there are fewer chances to lose the traditions of those cultures. So honoring the ancestors isn't just by honoring your specific ancestry or a general ancestry of the people who practiced the old ways and honored the old gods. Honoring the ancestors is maintaining their healthy traditions alive, maintaining their gods alive, their spiritual practices, and the entire cultural heritage. So, with all of this being said, how can we honor our ancestors in these modern times, or in modern heathenry? The beauty of the cult of the ancestors is that it can be personalized by each family according to their ancestors. The most common form is to construct a domestic altar, where photos or items relevant to the ancestors can be placed. At this altar, you can offer food and other things that the ancestors liked. The altar that you can create traditionally can be kept in a reserved area of your house. It's something deeply personal. If a specific ancestor enjoyed a type of beverage, why not placing it at the altar or even in their graves if it's possible? In any case, the cult of the ancestors belongs to the family. It is not something public, and there are some cases in ancient times where a visitor is asked to leave the place where the rituals were being performed. As I've said previously, with the Norse case of the Alfablot and Dísir, the cult of the ancestors is intensely private. This raises the question of when we should make such rites. Well, you can create specific dates for the occasion. Try the anniversary of their birth and of their death, for instance. Important dates that marked something meaningful to your ancestors. Create your own songs for them, poems even, and start a new tradition in your family that your descendants might continue to practice. If you want to follow the old ways in this aspect, well, among the Scandinavian peoples, the cult of the ancestors was usually during the winter season when the sacrifices were made, a season which began somewhere in our present autumn, somewhere around October and November. During this season, the Dísablut was celebrated after the celebration of the harvest, or Matronae, celebrated in the period of Yule among the Anglo-Saxons, which makes sense because during the long Scandinavian winter, it was quite common for everyone to stay at home in their houses and begin the slaughter of the cattle to support them during the long winter, and certainly the blood and meat of the cattle was used in the offerings to the ancestors. That's why these celebrations were called blots, sacrifices. Now, just remember, the cult of the ancestors is about honoring those who gave us life, to whom we owe directly our existence. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. And they don't have to necessarily be biological ancestors. There are heathens that include in their cult to the ancestors those who are like family to them, godparents, friends, etc., which often creates a strong bond among those involved. In these cases, it's not about the bloodline that it's important, but the bond between the family's friends who supported us and were present during our lives. The cult of the ancestors is not limited to the rituals. Respect is fundamental. To respect the memory of the living as well as of the dead. Respect and honor. Keep alive the memory of those who preceded us by sharing and keeping ancestral knowledge alive. Not much is said about this particular method of honoring ancestors, or at least not enough is said. One of the greatest gifts you can give your ancestors is to live a life of which they are proud. What better way to honor your ancestors than to live the kind of responsible, memorable, and fruitful life that would make them proud of you and what you accomplished with your time on earth. When making a choice in life, remember your ancestors. Try to visualize in your head if it's something that would make them proud. Maybe following your dreams is already reason enough to make them proud of you. Each one of us wish the best for our children and other descendants, and we would do almost anything to give them a little huge push they need to have a responsible and productive life. And when our children and grandchildren grow up to become strong and accomplished adults, we are very proud of them, naturally. So it should be no different for the dead. By living a life that they can be proud of, we show that we are not wasting or giving little thought to the gift of life. Many of our ancestors struggled and sacrificed themselves to give their offspring a better life than they had. And when we recognize this and conduct our lives with that in mind, we show our ancestors that we recognize and are grateful for what they did for us. Alright, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching this very extensive video. If you came this far, well, you are my new hero. And I'm sorry if I have done a couple of mistakes when pronouncing some words or a little slip of the tongue. Well, I actually bit my tongue while I was making this speech. It was a little bit difficult. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and a very special thanks to my patron, Mr. Colin Pedersen, who requested this video. Once again, thank you so much for being in there. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag.
Heathenry.